Cheers.
Thank you, Angelica. Next we'll hear from S.J. Fowler.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, dear friends. My route into beginning poetry is incredibly dramatic. It is an incredibly dramatic story, but I'm not going to tell you it. But it happened almost exactly 10 years ago, a little bit less. So I draw your attention to the date of this webpage currently live on the beautiful British art website, It's Nice That. 30th of August 2010. I had been doing poetry for 4 months. My first ever public engagement with poetry was March 2010 at the Writers' Forum in a dirty, particularly smelly, bitter pub in Old Street in London. And it was the Writers' Forum left behind by the great Bob Cobbing. Bob was already long dead, but his widow, Jennifer Pike Cobbing, was the unspoken honcho of that meeting, where people would walk in, stand up on their given turn, read a poem, sit down to the response of, "Yeah, it was all right, yeah." No one would really talk afterwards. They would badmouth mainstream British poetry, and I was scared. What I got when they started to have a few beers was stories about Bob Cobbing, what he did, the legacy he left, and what his work was about. Yesterday, very generously, Michael Lentz talked about Bob and his life and his influence, so I shan't repeat. And I shall just draw upon two things that I think this poem, Bob Cobbing's Square poem, illustrates. Before I do that, I would say too that what I got from Bob Cobbing in that moment, his ghost in the Writers' Forum, which still goes today, 50, 60 years on, although it is a strange little affair, I must admit, is that if your poetry is unpopular in the nation of your birth, you must maintain an international network of people to support that exchange. And my learning that from Bob Cobbing is the reason you're all in the room now. He had this extraordinary sense of respect from other nations, as was represented so beautifully when Mr. Lentz, a German poet, talked about a British poet yesterday. Meanwhile, in his own country, he was extraordinarily marginalised. So I learned that you really need to learn to do innovations for authentic and personal reasons and maintain them and never give up, because he never gave up. He performed every week, made thousands of publications on screen printers and risographs and in the basement of strange universities and art centres, and he published everyone from Siandel and the great Europeans to William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. So his legacy as an organiser is extraordinary and has influenced me. What really strikes me about his work, technically, he bridged the gap between understanding the fundamental realities that I've had to learn to teach my students who resist me when I tell them visual and sound poetry is important. Visual poetry has existed ubiquitously in all human cultures from the beginning of recorded memory, from cave paintings to religious writing in shape, and sound poetry is equally the same. People have always expressed themselves with non-semantic vocal art. Sound poetry and concrete poetry are not contemporary avant-gardes. They are essential ways to express the human condition. And his work did that while, vitally, before I shut up, maintaining an extraordinary streak of English humour. Humour is grace. It is a moral investment in the world. It is finding oneself ridiculous and thinking that's funny instead of tragic. Cobbing's poems, like the Square poem, are not intellectual, they're clever. So his work was overlooked precisely because it didn't force attention and it wasn't serious enough to be real poetry. So when he did a poem, it is embodied in this kind of gesture. Thank you so much.